Welcome, Internet, to a psychologist's casual review. And today we're going to do something a little left field, something that's not necessarily part of what I often do, but I really wanted to talk about it. As you might know, I'm a psychologist by trade. That's my job, that's what I specialize in, and that's the bulk of what I read. However, I do sometimes make exceptions for certain books, or just because I wanted to read on a certain topic. And today I wanted to talk about a book that kind of really blew my mind when I read it, which is Gilles Lipovetsky's Les Temps Hypermodern. I think they've translated it in English by Hypermodernity, but I couldn't be quite sure. I'm at 90% sure, but not 100. So this book is incredibly interesting because basically, for me, it poses the real question of where are we in terms of a society? And Gilles Lipovetsky kind of has an answer to this, at least in the frame of values. And we're only going to talk about values, not necessarily economics per se, or let's say tradition or politics, but really values on the whole. Basically, hypermodernity for Lipovetsky is this moment where basically we are in the most extreme version of the wellness or the well-being of the individual, meaning that basically the individual is stage front and center in everything. And basically we have gone postmodernity, if I may say so, and we have reached a moment where basically the individual is everything in terms of values, in terms of thought. And what he says is that basically there are massive contradictions in our systems. For example, he gives the idea that basically we have never been more pro science, more willing to dwell into the science and to investigate. And on the other hand, strangely enough, there has never been more religious sects coming through, like, for example, cults and so on and so forth. And he says that basically his whole thesis, which I found incredibly insightful, was that that's not a bug in the system. It's a feature, so to speak, or it's part of it. Everything is on the same level, meaning basically it's up to the individual to choose as basically as if he was offered all options to choose what he is or who he is or what he adheres to in terms of values. Basically, there's always going to be something that reflects what he chooses in society. And his whole point of view, and which I found incredibly interesting, is that basically everything coexists and they don't, at least in the system, not necessarily individual to individual, value to value, they don't contradict each other. They are together. Like they're one and the same, basically, on the same grid. For example, let's say you can be as religious and as scientific as you want. You can be, let's say, as ecological as you want, and yet you can also be as consumers as you want. And he said that basically all those things come together. Basically, there is no real contradiction within the system. There might be for individuals. Individual people might feel there's a dissonance, what we call cognitive dissonance within certain fields, or that things don't mash up too well. But that's to the individual, up to the individual. And that's what he tries to point out, is that basically the system allows you to do everything and anything at the same time. And for example, you can be as individualistic as you want, but you can also be part of a collective. That's not something that's contradictory. And he even goes so far as to state that basically people are very engaged in collective issues, more so now than maybe 20, 30 years ago, which is incredibly interesting because you would think that things have changed, people are no longer into the collective causes. And it's not true. They are, but it's just not the collective causes that we used to know, like the, let's say, the unions, all those old structures, like, for example, church, etc., etc. That might be true, but the collective on the whole is still very present. And I think that's very true. Like, you can see that, for example, people are still very, they come together. For example, when things happen, for example, Black Lives Matter, people have come together to fight for a cause. And the alternative is also true. Unfortunately, people who have right-wing slash fascist tendencies also come together. And that's another big point, is that basically he doesn't go into politics, but that's what I've understood, that these sins, like for example, the left and the right, the fact that both are polarized, it's not an issue, not for the system. It might be for the individuals and for each side, but for the system, very well they coexist and they are together. And in a way, this is basically an idea that everything just is on the same playing field. For example, never have we known as much of about, for example, health, nutrition, and yet there's been an explosion in fast food, in junk food, and so on and so forth. And I'm not shaming anyone, by the way. It's just examples. But basically, everything coexists, and I find that incredibly true. He also states that basically the person in our society wants to send a certain image. And I felt that that was very true with social media, with everything that's there. It just points out that basically we are no longer satisfied by being good. We want to be perfect, we want to be ideal. And that idealistic side, in the real sense of what an ideal means, meaning basically being perfect, is something that's very true. A lot of people curate their image until basically they get exactly what they want from the image, rather than being necessarily genuine, or at least show the genuineness within what they show. They tend to show a facade, or like Jung would call a persona. And he says that basically this is also hypermodernity. It's, you can be the most consumerist person, the most individualistic person, and seek an ideal of ecology and deconsumerism. Things do not, and that's the big essential part I've understood, is that sins are not exclusive, no longer exclusive. And meaning they don't contradict, it's not one or the other, it's both. And it can be quite confusing, and he points that out, that basically it's a paradigm shift. As was before, you'd have to be something or something else. Now it can be both. It's like, it's a bit like a market. It's just everyone can take a bit of everything and basically make their own fusion food, if I may say so, of values and ideas. And I found that very interesting, and it does and did help me really wrap my brain around the fact that there's so many contradictions all the time at every level. For example, just in psychology, that's going beyond the book, he doesn't talk about this, but for example, in psychology, you've got cognitive behavioral therapy, you've got psychoanalysis, you've got existentialism, you've got humanism, you've got Gestalt, and so many others. And those things can have an interesting discussion, and the things that can be very enriching for everyone if we talk about it. But they tend to be very contradictory in between themselves. Even within psychoanalysis, they can be current stuck, completely contradictory, and it's just basically are mutually exclusive. And basically, he's saying that in our modern world, well, you can be a bit of everything, and yeah, why not? And that's an interesting thought, and it helped me understand, or at least put it in a certain frame of mind, that I no longer feel lost within contradiction, that it's basically something that can be embraced. And I find that that's the more positive side of hyper modernity. Of course, the downsides being that basically it's still within a capitalistic frame, and basically there's a lot of downsides that are not necessarily a good thing. But just the frame of it was incredibly interesting. Well, I hope that you've also found my explanation interesting or worthwhile. So if there's anything you'd like to ask, or anything you feel that I missed, don't feel any anxiety. Just put it down in the comments and let me know. All right then, see ya.